Welcome to the debate. We thank you for making the time to listen to Resistance to Change, the Not My Job Barrier episode number 4, a mini-series from EAQ and Associates presenting Human Capital Intelligence audio podcast to better understand the most effective ways to maximize human capital resources and how an organization can enhance performance, engagement, productivity, and deliver desired outcomes by creating alignment between management and their employees.
Yeah, it is. It's really great to be here for this one. And I think to really unpack this, we have to establish exactly where we are standing right now. I mean, it is March 2026. The whole concept of the not my job barrier, it's undergone this radical evolution. Just a few years ago, we used to view it as, mere stubbornness, like an employee just dragging their feet on a new software rollout.
Right, the classic, I don't want to learn the new interface complaint.
Exactly. But today, in our current human times machine era, that barrier has morphed into a fundamental survival mechanism. We are looking at a landscape where 71% of workers are performing tasks well outside their original job descriptions, and that has triggered what we are calling a massive talent remix, and frankly, an absolute crisis of change fatigue across the enterprise.
That context is incredibly vital. Change is no longer this, periodic event that you can just schedule a Friday training session for. It is a permanent state of disruption. And that constant realignment forces us to examine the very core of how organizations function when the ground is just constantly shifting beneath them. Which brings us to the core of our discussion today, which revolves around a concept called the bridge to the issue, partnering for a fair exchange. Now, we both agree that a vulnerability exchange, a mutual lowering of defenses between the organization and its workforce, is absolutely necessary to navigate this era. Where we differ is on the primary engine of that exchange.
Right. We totally agree on the destination, but we disagree entirely on what actually fuels the car to get us there.
Precisely. My position is that the employer's structural concessions, specifically providing top-down safety periods and shifting the fundamental metrics of how work is judged to synergistic performance, are the foundational drivers of a successful transition. Without the employer building that structural scaffolding first, well, nothing else works.
And my position is that while those employer structures are certainly helpful, the employee's active co-creation is the true catalyst that makes the exchange actually function. An employee stepping up to manage what we call AI work slop and actively shifting their professional identity from being a passive victim of change to an active architect of the solution is what powers the transition. I mean, structure without active employee co-creation is just an empty shell.
To ground our analysis today, we are utilizing the analytical framework developed by HR architect Ernest Goss. As an executive coach and Six Sigma Black Belt who has worked with organized labor and executive leadership teams focused on outcomes for organizations. His work provides a fantastic lens for this. So looking through that lens, let me expand on my opening stance. I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on where the leverage truly lies. Let's look at the employer's perspective today. They are locked in a race for what the industry is calling stability.
Stability combined with agility.
Exactly. But what that actually means on the ground is that leaders are caught in this crushing growth efficiency paradox. They're basically telling their teams, we need you to deliver significantly better results, but we are also tightening your budgets. The goal is moving rapidly from a human plus machine model, where a human just uses a tool, to a true human times machine synergy, where the technology exponentially multiplies what the human can do. But getting there is incredibly painful. Look at the 2025 Gartner data. The average employee is navigating roughly 10 planned enterprise changes a year. The workforce's willingness to support change plummeted from 74% in 2016 to just 38% in 2022.
Yeah, that data point always staggers me.
Think about what that means in a real office. Over half the workforce simply threw their hands up and stopped caring. That isn't just fatigue, that is a systemic breakdown. And because that cognitive overload is so severe, the employer absolutely must make the first move in the vulnerability exchange. You cannot ask a drowning person to swim harder. According to the 2024 American Psychological Association Work in America report, top-down psychological safety is the bedrock requirement. The employer has to create a holding environment where it is safe to fail. Leadership has to publicly admit they don't have all the answers. If leadership doesn't unilaterally dismantle the risk of failure by providing structural safety, employees will naturally default to the not my job barrier simply to protect their livelihood. The structure has to come first.
I come at it from a different way. Look, top-down safety is conceptually wonderful in a boardroom, but it is effectively meaningless without bottom-up action on the floor. Let's look at the reality from the employee's desk in 2026. The overwhelm you mentioned isn't just some abstract psychological state. It is driven by a very specific, tangible problem we call work slop.
Right, the output problem.
Yes. For those familiar with the day-to-day grind, work slop is the fast, poor-quality output produced by autonomous AI that suddenly becomes the human employee's job to fix and verify. It's like having a wildly enthusiastic intern who works at the speed of light but gets 30% of the facts completely wrong. The manager, in this case the frontline employee, spends more time fixing the intern's mistakes than they would have spent just doing the job themselves from scratch. We are seeing workers spending nearly 22 hours a week, mired in this digital friction, just trying to coordinate systems enough to find 3 hours for actual meaningful deep work.
Which is exactly why they need the employer to structurally alleviate that pressure. They can't fix the work slop if they are terrified of being penalized for the delay it causes.
But the employer isn't the one dealing with the immediate output of those autonomous systems on the ground. From 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., the employee is the one actually collaborating with agentic AI. The employer can offer all the psychological safety in the world, but if the employee doesn't actively engage with the friction, nothing changes. Consider the aid car model of change management.
Awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement.
Exactly. Now, management can easily handle the first and third steps. They can mandate awareness, the why of the change, and provide knowledge, like a technical training session. But the ability and desire stages, you cannot mandate desire. Those stages require the employee to actively shift their identity. They have to want to adapt. I look back to the program name, Human Capital Intelligence, and the instructor's name, Ernest Goss, a human resources practitioner, executive coach, and Six Sigma black belt. He shows that successful transitions require employees to actively flag defects and propose solutions. They cannot be passive recipients of a safety period. They have to be the active engines of the transition.
I understand the need for active employee participation, but I think you're misdiagnosing why they aren't participating in the first place. This is where we hit a real point of contention. The true root of the not my job barrier? If we look at the research from Villanova University, they identify deep, subconscious psychological triggers driving this resistance. We are talking about loss aversion, status quo bias, and identity attachment.
Identity attachment is a huge one.
It is massive. Imagine a tenured professional, say a senior financial analyst who has spent 15 years mastering incredibly complex spreadsheet modeling. They tie their professional value and really their entire workplace identity to those established workflows. When a new AI initiative is announced that can do that modeling in seconds, it feels like a direct challenge to their core competence. The fear of looking incompetent in a new system is paralyzing. That is why the root of the barrier is psychological fear. And the only way to dismantle that fear is for the manager to step away from being a dictator of process and become a facilitator who offers explicit, proactive rest.
Proactive rest?
Yes, deliberately giving teams sanctioned downtime to absorb the cognitive load of a new system. The data shows that providing proactive rest boosts performance by 26%. You cannot ask an employee to overcome deep cognitive biases without the employer first lowering the stakes.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Framing the not my job barrier purely as an emotional or psychological fear ignores the intensely practical reaction to a technical reality. Yes, identity attachment is real, but look at the Harvard Business Publishing study on global leadership. It reveals that only about 50% of employees feel their organization truly sees them as people. This creates what economists call the Great Detachment.
So you're saying the barrier is more cynical.
I'm saying it's logical. If an employee feels like a highly replaceable digital doppelganger, their refusal to take on new, out-of-scope work isn't just an irrational fear of the unknown. It is a highly calculated protective measure. Why should I train the AI system that I believe management intends to replace me with?
But that calculation is driven exactly by the employer's failure to provide a safe, transparent environment. If leadership provided the structural safety I'm talking about, that calculation would completely change.
It is driven by a mutual dynamic that requires adaptive leadership from the employee just as much as the employer. An adaptive challenge requires a change in people's values, beliefs, and habits. If employees don't actively engage in that adaptive work, if they don't take ownership of reshaping their own habits, the employer's perfectly designed holding environment just becomes a stagnant waiting room. You can build all the structural safety you want, but if the employee just sits back and uses that safety period to sit back and wait for the initiative to blow over, hoping management gets distracted by the next shiny object, you're stuck. The practical reality of integrating with agentic AI requires the employee to look at the work stop, dissect it, and build a better process. The root of overcoming the barrier is the employee making the conscious decision to move.
Let's transition then to how we actually execute the bridge to the issue, partnering for a fair exchange, because this is where the mechanics of my argument really prove out. The critical elements of the open source change playbook is that the employer fundamentally changes the metrics. This is the ultimate structural concession.
How so?
Think about it. You cannot ask an employee to learn how to collaborate with agentic AI if you are still measuring their individual output on the old scale. If my financial analyst is trying to learn the new AI tool, their output is going to drop temporarily. If their quarterly review still measures traditional individual output, they are going to abandon the AI and go back to what works just to save their bonus. The employer must move to measuring synergistic performance.
Meaning we measure the aggregate value of the human-machine collaboration?
Exactly. Evaluating the aggregate value created by the collaborative team, rather than punishing the individual who is still a novice at the new skill. The employer must bear the risk of the safety period. When the organization takes on that risk and shifts the metrics, the results are undeniable. The risk of change fatigue falls by 29 points, and the intent to stay increases by nearly 20 points. Organizations using this open-source, guidance-driven approach are 14 times more likely to achieve change success. The fair exchange works because the employer writes a completely new contract of expectations that removes the penalty for learning.
Changing metrics is definitely important, but it's fundamentally a passive framework. A new contract requires two active signatories to actually work. The fair exchange only balances if the employee steps up as a performance coach for the entire system.
A performance coach for the AI?
Yes, shifting metrics to synergistic performance is a nice idea, but who is actually creating that synergy? The employee has to manage up. They have to look at the new workflow, identify where the AI is hallucinating or failing, and bring possible solutions to leadership rather than just pointing out problems.
But they only do that if the metrics make it safe to do so. They won't stick their neck out if they're graded on an outdated curve.
They do it because they take ownership of their own expertise. This is exactly what we see in the field. Remember, Ernest Goss, a HR practitioner, has worked with frontline employees, organized labor, managers, and executive leadership teams, focused on outcomes for organizations. That extensive on-the-ground experience proves that cross-functional collaboration absolutely requires the front line to actively co-create the process. They cannot just wait for management to make it safe. The frontline workers are the process experts. They're the ones who know exactly why a new software rollout is adding 22 hours of digital friction to their week. If they don't actively coach the system and tell management how the implementation needs to be adjusted, the structural concessions of the employer are applied blindly, The employee's active co-creation is the navigational system for the employer's structural vehicle.
I see the value in that, which leads us perfectly into our final point of contention, the distinction between technical and adaptive challenges. When we look at the 2025 Deloitte Global Human Capital Trends, we see a massive agility disconnect. Leaders are aggressively preparing for agile operational models, while the workforce is rapidly retreating towards stability. The reason these change initiatives fail so often is that leaders treat adaptive challenges, like building a culture of cross-functional collaboration, as if they were simple technical challenges.
Like treating a massive cultural shift as if it were just a 1-hour software training session.
Precisely. They think, we installed the software, why isn't the culture agile? To solve this, top-down clarity and vulnerability are absolutely required. The leader must clearly outline the purpose and scope of the change. They have to paint the architectural vision. Without that top-down clarity, the workforce remains trapped in a wait-and-see cycle, leading to lost momentum.
I completely agree that identifying the difference between technical and adaptive challenges is key, but that distinction actually proves the employee's paramount role. An adaptive challenge, by definition, cannot be solved by an expert handing down a solution from on high. It requires the people with the problem to change their own behavior. Using the 80KR model again, an employer can easily provide the first step, awareness, the why of the change. They can provide the third step, knowledge, the technical training. But the employer cannot force desire.
The employer facilitates desire by offering the right incentives and that safety period we discussed.
They can offer incentives, sure, but the internal motivation, the actual desire to engage with the transition instead of fighting it, must be generated internally by the employee. And more importantly, ability. The actual proficiency to execute the new collaborative behavior requires the employee to practice, to fail, and to try again. An employer can offer a holding environment, but the employee has to step into the ring. They have to stop saying, that's not my job, and start saying, how can I adapt my skills to make this work? The heavy lifting of an adaptive challenge is done by the individual deciding to change their own mindset.
I would argue the individual's mindset is heavily conditioned by the environment the organization builds around them. But let's look at the ultimate proof of both our frameworks to wrap this up. When we look at the ultimate proof of the top-down framework, we have to look at the outcomes mandated by this approach. What the employer gains, something far more valuable than obedience. They get immediate, friction-free adoption. The need for forced compliance disappears because the team is actually helping build the new standard. By providing the vulnerability, the structural safety, and the shift to synergistic metrics, the employer unlocks the full potential of their human capital, transforming the organization into a true frontier firm.
And when we look at the ultimate proof of the bottom-up active framework, we see the true value of individual agency. What the employee gains, the specific support and resources you need to remain competent. You get to move forward with confidence, knowing that a major shift in strategy doesn't mean a shift in your value to the company. You aren't just surviving the change, you're mastering it. When the employee steps up to co-create, they secure their own psychological security and ensure they remain indispensable in a highly automated world.
I think we can certainly agree that when these two perspectives are combined, when the employer's structural vulnerability meets the employee's active co-creation, the organization achieves what is known as the synergistic dividend. The combined effort of irreplaceable human capital and advanced technology creates a resilience that redefines the market. We leave it to you, the listener, to determine which force carries the heaviest weight in driving this transition within the Human Capital Intelligence Framework. Thank everyone for joining our 3-part mini-series, Human Capital Intelligence Series, presented by EAQ and Associates. We will continue to explore the intersection between business problems, operations, and strategy. HR architect Ernest Gauss uses Six Sigma and data-driven architecture to solve complex organizational problems. We invite you to visit their website at eaqassociates.com. Join us for episode number 5. We will be discussing AI replacement. Well, I have a job tomorrow in our next session. Our goal is to equip you with the tools to turn your human capital into a sustainable competitive advantage and build the bridge that sustains a viable organization while creating opportunities for its employees. We'll see you next time.